distinguished guests, professors, students, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zhang Yi, a student from the National University of Singapore History Department, and I'm truly honored to serve as the MC for this evening's event. And a very warm welcome to everyone to the second annual G.L. Lewis Distinguished Lecture in Religious Pluralism at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. And we are pleased to welcome the esteemed Professor Charles Keys from Michigan State University as our distinguished lecturer. The lecture will be followed by a question and answer session moderated by Professor Noor Amli Ibrahim. And without further ado, let me invite Professor Jack Mondaccia, Assistant Dean of Research at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and co-chair of the G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Cluster, to deliver the welcome remarks. Professor Chow, please.
Good evening, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, or FASS, at the National University of Singapore, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our second G.L. Lewis Distinguished Lecture, hosted by the FASS Research Division. The Research Division plays a central role in promoting and supporting the humanities and social sciences at NUS by fostering impactful research, encouraging interdisciplinary collaboration, and creating platforms for engagement with both academic and the wider public. One of the key ways the Research Division does this is through its research clusters. These clusters bring together scholars from different fields to develop new research agendas, host scholarly and public-facing events, and respond creatively to emerging intellectual and societal questions. In short, they help scholars talk to one another across disciplinary boundaries, often over free food. In short, they help, over the years, FASS has supported a wide range of clusters, reflecting both the diversity of research within the faculty and our collective commitment to think together, sometimes loudly, but usually productively. The G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Cluster, funded by an endowment established through a generous gift in memory of Mr. G.L. Lewis, is dedicated to fostering the academic study of religious pluralism and diverse religious traditions in Asia and beyond. It aims to provide a platform for interdisciplinary research and to facilitate thoughtful conversations across scholars, practitioners, and the wider public. Coincidentally, I have just learned that today marks the 30th anniversary of Mr. Lewis' passing, making it especially meaningful for us to be gathered in the spirit of the work and his generosity, and hope his generosity continues to inspire us. We are deeply grateful to the Lewis family for the continued support of NUS. In a society such as Singapore, where religious diversity is a lived and everyday reality, visible in our neighborhoods, our festivals, and our everyday social interactions, the academic study of religion plays an important role. Religious studies provides the tools to understand religious tradition in their historical depth and social complexity, to appreciate difference without reducing it to stereotype, and to cultivate informed and sincere engagement across communities. At a time where religion continues to shape public life, careful scholarship and open dialogue are essential to fostering mutual understanding and social trust. It is in this spirit that the G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Cluster seeks to foster meaningful research, dialogue, and exchange. Finally, we hope that the annual G.L. Lewis Distinguished Lecture will continue to serve as a platform for meaningful scholarly exchange and public engagement. Mr. Lewis was a devout Catholic, yet he hoped that his gift would not only support the academic study of Christianity, but also encourage deeper understanding and dialogue across diverse religious traditions. In honor of his commitment and legacy, we are delighted this year to have Professor Charles Keith with us to deliver a lecture on Catholicism and empire, a topic that invites us to reflect on religion, history, and global connections. I hope you will enjoy the lecture and the discussion that follows, and I wish everyone a very enriching and wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Char. And may I now invite Professor Noor Amali Ibrahim, co-chair designate of G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Cluster, to introduce Professor Keith. Professor Amali, please.
Good evening, everyone. It's really my honor to introduce the speaker for tonight's distinguished lecture. Professor Charles Keith received his PhD from Yale University and is currently professor of history at Michigan State University. He is also author of 2 award-winning books. The first is titled Catholic Vietnam, A Church from Empire to Nation, that was published in 2012, and the more recent one, published in 2024, is titled Subjects and Sojourners. Professor Keith also previously served as co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Vietnamese Studies. And the title for the talk today is New Histories of Catholicism and Empire. I think we are all in for a treat. So please join me and welcome Professor Charles Keith.
Good evening. I'd just like to begin by saying what an honor it is to be here. I think this is the first time that I have been the feature of something explicitly labeled distinguished. I'm humbled to be standing here before you, given that there are so many wonderful scholars around the world who might just as easily be in my place. It's also my first time in Singapore after half a lifetime studying Southeast Asia, and I'm very grateful to finally have the chance to see it. Thank you very, very much to all of you who have made my visit possible. Thank you especially to the generous donors who established the G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Cluster here at NUS. Thanks to Dr. Jack Mengtachia for kindly extending the invitation. Thanks to Dr. Noor Amali Ibrahim for the kind introduction. To Yok Chun for, where is he? For his patient assistance with logistics. And of course, thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your evening to attend the event. I'm only saddened not to see in the audience my dear friend Gerard Sasjas, who was your colleague here at NUS and who sadly passed away in August. I would just like to briefly honor his memory. He was an exemplary scholar and an even better human being. With your forbearance, I thought I would begin with the story of a personal road to Damascus moment of sorts as I was writing my first book about the history of Catholicism in Vietnam. When I began researching the topic about 25 years ago now, I came to the topic with a background in Vietnamese history, not in the history of religion in general or in the history of Catholicism in particular. What this meant was that I had a clear sense that the church's role in modern Vietnamese history was important and misunderstood, but I had a much muddier sense of exactly how to approach the problem. I had been flailing about in French archives for a couple of months when I discovered files about the ordination in 1933 of the first Vietnamese bishop, Jean-Baptiste Nguyen Ba Thom. As I read the files, I was flabbergasted to learn that an event I thought French authorities would surely have celebrated had instead produced deep anxiety that it would stoke nationalist opposition to colonial rule and facilitate foreign influence in a French colony. So much so that it occupied the attention of the highest levels of the French Foreign Ministry for months. Clearly, I remember feeling there are important things about this that I do not understand. In retrospect, that feeling partly reflected the personal ignorance of a young scholar newly arrived at the study of Catholicism. But it's also fair to say that at the time, scholars studying the Church's modern global history had far less to guide them than they do now. Early in my studies, I had searched high and low for a good general history of the modern global Church to fill the many, many gaps in my knowledge of the subject. The best thing I could find at the time was this book, Nicholas Atkins and Frank Tallett's 2003 Priest, Prelates, and Peoples, A History of European Catholicism Since 1750. Although it's a good book and still worth reading, it ignores the single greatest change in the modern Catholic Church. In 1900, 2/3 of its believers lived in Europe, but a century later, 2/3 of them live in the global South. If one had to identify the historical force most responsible for this tidal shift, it would be empire. But this book, reflecting the state of the field at that moment, astoundingly devotes just 5 of its 333 pages, I counted, to the modern European empires. So when I began researching the modern Vietnamese church, I felt a bit like the blind man in the Buddhist parable who thinks that he knows what an elephant looks like by having touched just one part of it. But if you'll indulge the metaphor, I soon realized that there were many other people feeling their way through their own parts of the elephant of the church's modern global history. A generation later, we now have a rich literature on the subject, grounded in transnational methodologies and drawing from archives in Rome and around the global South that scholars have only recently been able to access. The purpose of my talk tonight is to offer a sort of brief interpretive tour of this transformative generation of scholarship. I'm aware and very gratified that among you are renowned scholars of Asian Catholicism, scholars of other religious traditions, scholars of non-religious subjects, students, and community members. And I've tried my best to craft this talk in a way that can meaningfully connect and appeal to all of you. Two core ideas and claims of this new scholarship serve as the foundation of my talk this evening. The first is that in the global history of the Catholic Church, empire cannot simply serve as a context. It must also serve as a method and a mode of analysis. Today, this may seem far from a novel insight, but it's worth remembering how recently empire operated more as a polemic than as a category of analysis in church history. Many confessional historians, especially those writing after empire had ceased to be a normative form of governance, were often uncomfortable with the church's past relationship to empire and sought to downplay or even ignore it. Conversely, other scholars, often poorly trained in religious history and at times with a political axe to grind, cast the church as an enthusiastic imperial handmaiden, and far more egregiously cast Catholics outside of the West as little more than victims of false consciousness. These bad old days began to fade roughly in the 1990s with 2 important scholarly turns. One was the rise of world Christianity, a field and method committed to exploring the diversity and autonomy of Christianity outside of the West. This was essentially a post-colonial turn in explicitly Christian fields of study, missiology, theology, ecumenics, etc. Its core institutional home were usually divinity schools. World Christianity approaches remain foundational to any study of Christianity in our time. But as some of its own practitioners have pointed out, that field's efforts to reestablish the agency of diverse global forms of Christian practice have led it at times to de-emphasize the hierarchies and power structures that are, in the history of Christianity, inescapable. This brings us to the other scholarly turn that is crucial to new histories of the Catholic Church. And that's the so-called imperial turn in the discipline of history, which also in the 1990s began to move the study of empire beyond the realms of diplomatic and military history. We now know the European empires in which the Church's global history unfolded to have been contingent and contested power structures shaped by the disparate competing agendas of states, private capital, settlers, and other European actors, including religious ones. We also know, of course, that these empires were profoundly shaped by the cultures and politics of colonized societies, and that empires drove encounters and cultural exchanges that blurred lines between colonizers and colonized and produced inherently shared modernities. The conceptual frameworks and core insights of the new imperial history have given scholars of Catholic history new ways to think about the Church's diverse and disparate collection of actors and its sites and forms of socio-cultural encounter. This has produced a much more sophisticated and interesting portrait of Catholicism's critical but complex relationship to forms of European imperial power. This scholarship has also deepened our knowledge of the Church as a form of empire in and of itself, not just in a spiritual or juridical sense, but in deeply material and political ways. An empire whose institutional, economic, and territorial logics and evolutions were very consequential and arguably still ongoing. New histories of Catholicism and empire rest on a second foundational insight that I'll talk about tonight. And that is that the modern history of the relationship between the Church and European empires, so the 19th and 20th centuries, represents an evolution and even a rupture that we must understand on its own terms. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, Iberian empires in the Americas and in Asia formally grounded much of their rule in Catholic ideology and institutions. This gave the Church enormous power to carry out what one historian has described as an imposed religious revolution, which utterly reshaped the economic, sociocultural, and of course, spiritual structures of the Western Hemisphere. This remained true even in times of tension or break with European royal authority. In contrast, missionaries had a far more distant and ambivalent relation to the proto-imperial European presence in other parts of the early modern world. In some cases, this gave missionaries enormous autonomy and power as cultural intermediaries and political brokers. But in others, it left missions vulnerable to persecution and at times total destruction. I hope that the early modern scholars of Catholicism here this evening will forgive my inexcusably brief and schematic rendering of their area of expertise. I offer it only to argue that early modern contexts are ultimately not terribly useful as frameworks to understand the relationship between the Church and European imperialism in the 19th and 20th centuries, an era when industrialization and modern practices of governance utterly transformed European imperialism, and the rise of secular European states and ultramontane Catholicism utterly transformed the Church. So then, what was the relationship between European empires and the Catholic Church in the 19th and 20th centuries? How did the Church evolve as a form of empire in and of itself during this era? My talk tonight will explore how a generation of scholarship has approached these two foundational questions. Two distinct but overlapping forms of European expansion swept across Asia and Africa in the 19th century. The first was a form of state imperialism very different from its early modern predecessors. Industrial capitalism replaced mercantilism as its core material logic. Its ideological language, far less Christian than in the past, proclaimed a vision of civilization shaped by social Darwinism and scientific racism. The second form of European expansion in this era was Christian, in the form of Protestant and Catholic missionary movements. The Protestant missionary movement, which had no meaningful historical precedent, was driven by evangelical revivals in the United States and Great Britain. The Catholic missionary movement, in this case meaningfully a revival, reflected the Church's resurgence in Europe in the aftermath of the French Revolution, as well as Rome's growing financial and institutional support for missionary activity. I'll speak in more depth about this in a few minutes. Before about 1870, the European political landscape generally posed few obstacles to close cooperation between state imperialism and Catholic missionary activity. France, which was the place of origin for the great majority of these missionaries, had strongly pro-Catholic governments from 1815 until 1870, except for brief revolutionary interludes in 1830 and 1848. The political landscape was similar in Belgium, Italy, and Spain, where most of the rest of the world's Catholic missionaries in the 19th century came from. Between the 1830s and the 1860s, missionary societies expanded alongside the conquests of French and Belgian armies in North and West Africa. In the 1840s and 1850s, France's early naval invasions in Vietnam were in no small part to defend missionaries and native Catholics threatened by the Vietnamese court's anti-Catholic policies. But European politics, especially in Catholic majority nations, changed radically from roughly 1870 until World War I, which was precisely the high point of European imperial expansion. In Europe, liberal regimes sought to modernize and unify their nations under explicitly secular forms of government. This meant direct confrontation with the Church's persistent legal, educational, and political influence, basically the unfinished business of the French Revolution. This dynamic was, of course, especially central to France, which was both the epicenter of the world's Catholic missionary movement and its second largest empire. In 1877, the founder of the French Third Republic, Léon Gambetta, stood in the Chamber of Deputies and thundered, "Clericalism, that is the enemy." But just a few years later, Gambetta would publicly proclaim the opposite, that anti-clericalism is not an article for export. Gambetta's conflicting positions capture a core insight of the new scholarship on global Christianity. In many parts of the world, it was conflicts and compromises between Catholic and secular visions of empire that defined what empire was and how it evolved in the 19th and 20th centuries. Missionaries and colonial officials certainly had much to disagree about. In the French Empire, most colonial officials now cast civilization in explicitly secular terms: political liberalism, progress, and science, the latter of which saw racial inequality as a matter of genetics and biology. But missionaries, of course, had long understood civilization as Catholic faith and believed that conversion could transcend the inequalities they perceived between Europeans and others. Many of these missionaries, even those whose missions were in fraught circumstances, first saw the spread of secular colonialism as a mortal danger. In a changing Europe where nation was displacing other forms of identity, colonial officials feared the divided missionary loyalties of even their own compatriots, and they saw missionaries from elsewhere as subversive simply by virtue of their foreign nationality. These dynamics had no parallel in the early modern European empires. Rome admittedly had something to do with this. In 1870, the First Vatican Council affirmed papal primacy and rejected the principle of secular authority over church law and institutions. With more and more financial and administrative support for missions coming directly from Rome, many missionaries, now in the middle of a clash between nation states and the ultramontane church, genuinely did struggle, with divided loyalties. In this ideological context, it's not a surprise that missionaries and colonial officials often competed fiercely for influence. The arrival of secular colonial rule drove the expansion of mission schools, orphanages, and health establishments. Competition from Catholic networks, in turn, hastened transitions from military occupation to full colonial civilian administration. This is a dynamic particularly pronounced in the French Empire. Colonial archives from West Africa to Southeast Asia are full of episodes of conflict between Catholic and colonial, judicial, fiscal, and legal, and land regimes. Colonial officials often saw missionary attitudes and behavior as disruptive of social stability and political order. Many missionaries felt the same way about colonial military and economic interventions. But in the end, compromise won out over conflict. In Europe, war's outbreak in 1914 prompted what in France was called the Union Sacrée, or Sacred Union, a compromise between political factions in the name of wartime patriotic unity. In the French Empire, where the war was far more remote, colonial sacred unions instead reflected the pragmatic recognition that missionaries and colonial administrators needed each other. Indeed, as colonial officials had begun to reckon with fiscal limits and the frictions of daily governance, they had come to view Catholic schools and health establishments, God-fearing as they were, as important collaborators in day-to-day governance. Missionaries, if properly managed, could be invaluable sources of local knowledge. Some missionaries were, as one historian has described them, incidental ethnographers, whose deep knowledge of local languages and social practices had been invaluable to the many colonial officials who had little to no background in the places they were now governing. Less capable missionaries remained important as sources of day-to-day intelligence. Missionaries, for their part, gradually came to recognize that European colonial rule, however secular it may be, offered myriad opportunities for expansion. Colonial authority provided baseline levels of physical security that had often been absent in the past. Ongoing waves of violence against missionaries in Qing China made the comparative stability of colonial situations very clear. In the generation before World War I, missionary societies and orders, male and female, grew by orders of magnitude in Asian and African colonies, and many benefited from land acquisitions and financial subsidies from colonial regimes. For many Catholic missionaries, the competing Protestant mission movement was as great a threat as secular colonialism, and many of them came to see France's imperial rivalries with Britain as helping their anti-Protestant cause. This was true even though British imperial administrations were generally acceptive and even supportive of Catholic missionary activity. As modus vivendi emerged in day-to-day affairs, mutual recriminations, colonial officials as godless agents of Satan, missionaries as obscurantist fanatics, gave way to common ideological ground. Colonial officials began describing missionary collaborators as patriots, while Catholic organizations and periodicals emphasized missionaries' commitment to spreading civilization instead of just Catholicism, and highlighted their practical contributions to colonial rule. While this was in part a public relations campaign aimed at suspicious colonial authorities, it did reflect deep and real cultural change among Catholic missionaries in the generation before the First World War, for whom the nation, as contested as the idea was becoming a central form of their identity as well. By the early 20th century, many Catholic missionaries not only spoken, but thought in the language of one 1911 article entitled, "What Missionaries Do in Africa." The article described missionary efforts for, and I'm quoting here, a revolution, a complete change in the ideas that hold the savage in barbarity, and that bar the road to all moral, social, humanitarian, and even material progress. Conversion, it continued, was not just a pathway to the kingdom of God. It prepares the soul to receive the germs of progress and civilization. This typical expression of Catholic missionary worldviews in the early 20th century reflects enormous transformations since the early modern era, when missionaries, depending on the context, had pursued their vocations animated by everything from extremely violent religious logics to eschatologies that were genuinely free from beliefs in earthly racial or cultural hierarchies. But by the 20th century, this broad and often unpredictable spectrum of missionary belief had largely faded into the past, most Catholic missionaries around the world at this time had generally internalized a Catholic variant of modern nationalism and its faith in European civilizational superiority. This gradual ideological convergence between Catholic and secular visions of imperialism during the generation before World War I ultimately made it possible for missionaries to accept and collaborate with the colonial projects of secular European states, whose influence, in the end, they simply could not compete with. In many parts of the world, therefore, empire was the product of parallel and often competing Catholic and secular civilizing missions. But the new scholarship that I'm speaking about tonight has an equally important core concern, and that is the Church's evolutions as a form of empire in and of itself during the modern era. Any proper assessment of this idea first requires reestablishing two contexts, which I have mentioned briefly tonight. The first is the 19th century Catholic missionary revival, which emerged as Europe's Catholic churches attempted to contend with the explosion in Protestant missionary activity and to resurrect themselves after the seismic upheavals of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Beginning in the 1820s, missionary organizations, funded largely by donations from lay Catholics, supported Italian, Spanish, German, Belgian, and especially French Catholic missionaries fanning out into Asia and Africa. The second critical context was Ultramontanism, the ideology of papal infallibility and of a doctrinally and institutionally centralized church, affirmed in the First Vatican Council in 1869-1870. Ultramontanism was partly a reaction to the rise of European secular nation-states, but it was also in many ways their Catholic equivalent. It was a project to modernize and expand the reach of church institutions and to use new technologies like popular literature, radio, and moving images to cultivate a sort of supranational nationalism, a sense of feeling, an affinity, and connection between all of the world's Catholics. Missionary revival and Ultramontanism were at first largely separate evolutions in 19th century Catholic history, but they soon intersected to give Europe's Catholics a far greater presence and influence in Catholic life in colonial empires than ever before. This meant that the peak of global European imperial dominance from roughly the late 19th century until the Second World War was also arguably the moment when the church itself most closely resembled a global imperial formation. On what grounds is this claim justifiable? And this point of view of the church kind of functioning and organized as an empire is a debate in the scholarship, and it'd be fun to talk about this in the Q&A. But on what grounds is this claim justifiable? Well, recent scholarship on Catholic missions during the height of the new imperialism, and this includes my own book, underscore not just the mission's crucial interactions with state imperialism, they also underscore, to borrow here Victor Lieberman's felicitous phrase, the strange parallels between mission activity and state imperialism. To begin with, it's essential to appreciate just how many more European Catholics there were in Africa and Asia in the late 19th century than there had ever been before. Colonial rule created safer, more stable conditions for European Catholics in many parts of the world. Not just missionaries, but also members of religious orders focused on social welfare and education. I don't have good global statistics on this point, but we can at least tentatively extrapolate from the numbers that I compiled from my book on Vietnam. At the dawn of French rule in Vietnam in the 1860s, there were about 80 European missionaries in the country, but by World War I, there were over 500. And that does not account for hundreds more from non-missionary orders who arrived during that time. This is an increase of as much as 800% in half a century. After the First Vatican Council, Rome began to expand its oversight of this burgeoning European Catholic global network. It grew the number of global apostolic vicariates, which are formal administrative designations for missions. It exerted greater influence over their leadership and finances, and it established apostolic delegations, all of which linked Rome more directly to mission territories. In Asia, the first two formal apostolic delegations were created in India in 1881 and in the Philippines in 1900, with many more to follow after World War I. How did this expanding European Catholic presence change Catholic life in European colonial empires? Although this undoubtedly led to some conversions, it is actually difficult to cite mission expansion during this era as the main reason for the distribution of the Church's global population today. That was much more the result of demographic growth and the Church's growing appeal around the global South during the post-colonial era, when it was precisely the decline in European missionary activity that made Catholicism more appealing to many in those parts of the world. But the growing European Catholic presence in European empires did have many immediate consequences. The most visible ones were material. Although missionary societies and religious orders were never rolling in money, growing support from Rome meant that they now often arrived in their missions with what were, comparatively speaking, substantial financial resources, as well as with strong ideas about how best to use those resources. Many missions, as I mentioned, benefited from the land sales and cessions that often took place under colonial rule. Many new mission lands were devoted to generating revenue through agricultural production or animal husbandry, and were worked by local Catholics via various rent, tenancy, and communal practices. Expanded mission land holdings rarely led to deep, lasting change in local forms of economic life, with some exceptions, like the role of Trappist monks in the Algerian wine industry. But they did bring meaningful change in labor practices and experiences in what were largely European-controlled Catholic landholdings. Missions and religious orders in the modern colonial empires, again with growing support from Rome, also spread Catholic educational and social welfare institutions in colonized societies with significant effects. Perhaps the most notorious example of this is the North American and Australian boarding schools meant to permanently detach Indigenous or Aboriginal peoples from their ways of life and communities. Much more typical were new Catholic schools which brought youth from elite Catholic families into European educational cultures and norms. The organization, curricula, and pedagogies of seminaries and catechetical schools also evolved in ways that reflected growing European influence. Catholic medical clinics, dispensaries, orphanages, and leper colonies, again now European-led, became vectors for new forms of knowledge and practices in public health and social welfare. Even the spread of neo-Gothic churches in 19th and 20th century empires reveals the growing influence of European Catholics over resources and labor in local Catholic life. European Catholics also acquired far more influence in shaping the relations of Catholic communities with other elements of colonial societies. Missionaries were often the most important intermediaries between Catholic communities and colonial officials in routine bureaucratic, judicial, and fiscal matters, as well as in episodes of unrest or conflict. Missionaries also often worked as liaisons with European labor recruiters. Sociologically, this began to blur distinctions between missionaries and colonial officials for many Asian and African Catholics. Missionaries also acquired greater authority in representing Catholic communities in interfaith relations. This could be a double-edged sword. Missionary access to political authority often helped, but their lack of local knowledge and frequent intransigence toward non-Catholics could make things worse, especially when missionaries tried to discredit non-Catholic religious leaders and notables with colonial authorities. This happened often in predominantly Islamic contexts. As European Catholics acquired greater power over financial resources, education, and welfare institutions, and greater influence in relations with social and political authorities, this began to thrust local clergy and other notables into auxiliary and secondary roles, often marginalizing them. Moreover, in the context of Vatican I's injunction for renewed orthodoxy, many missionaries felt obliged or emboldened to intervene more directly in myriad social and spiritual practices. These interventions ranged from new strictures on conditions for taking communion, giving confession, and receiving absolution, stricter forms of penance, restrictions on diet, work, speech, and other social behavior, prohibitions on the use of certain symbols or objects in ritual contexts, and efforts to eliminate superstitious practices. Without turning to any kind of apologetics, this moment in the talk deserves an important caveat. Much like the social history of empire more broadly, the social history of Catholic encounters in the modern European empires often bears little resemblance to the Manichaean portrait of hierarchy and division that I have sketched here. Even at its peak, the European Catholic presence in modern European empires was often limited and sporadic, especially outside of cities or densely populated rural regions. Local spiritual cultures and social practices persisted. Communities of faith were not all riven by racial tensions. We see evidence of this in the persistent importance of Europeans and Catholic communities around Asia and Africa well after independence, and in the real anguish caused by the forced departures or deaths of European Catholics in contexts of violent decolonization. And yet, this social history, until recently neglected by scholars of both the Church and of colonialism, does in fact reveal just how disruptive European Catholic expansion could be for the spiritual and social fabrics of much of the rest of the Catholic world in the 19th and early 20th centuries. This is an image from Vietnam in 1910 of 3 priests whose relations with French missionaries had become so bad that they joined an anti-French political movement. They were jailed after their bishop reported them to colonial authorities. The visibility of this incident was unusual, but its underlying causes were not. By the early 20th century, thousands of letters and petitions were flooding into Rome from the European empires. These were, for global Catholic missions, much like the cahiers de doléances, the lists of grievances sent to France's king that illuminated its profound social tensions on the eve of revolution. These agonized, angry letters reveal dynamics widespread in global Catholic missions at that time. The dismissive missionary treatment of local clergy, segregation in communal contexts, new markers of hierarchy in language and daily life, competition for resources, clashes over social and ritual practices, and occasional, but not that occasional, episodes of conflict serious enough to force colonial authorities to intervene. By the early 20th century, a tension at the heart of the Catholic missionary revival had thus been laid bare. Although the stated goal of mission work had long been to build self-sustaining churches, many missionary societies had worked above all else to solidify their own presence and precedence overseas. Perhaps the best reason to take seriously the parallels between mission expansion and the broader imperial and colonial projects of the time is simply the fact that so many Catholics who lived through both of them saw them as similar, if not inseparable. I could not capture this sentiment more simply and effectively than did a group of Vietnamese priests in a letter they wrote to Rome in 1926. They wrote, "French missionaries oppress us in religion like other French do in politics." I'm speaking to you tonight almost exactly a century after this letter was written, in a time when the global Catholic Church bears little resemblance to the one those Vietnamese priests were describing. To this point tonight, I've argued that to properly understand the Church's global history in the 19th century, we must not only consider its close and complex relationship to European forms of imperialism, but the parallels between them. In what remains of my talk, I would like to make a broadly similar argument about decolonization. Much as European imperial expansion was for the 19th century, imperial collapse was the single most significant global conjuncture for the Church's 20th century. But decolonization was not just an external political and cultural phenomenon for the Church to contend with. Decolonization was a process that the church experienced itself, a series of transitions, transformations, and struggles as missionary-led churches around the world gave way to new national ones. Global Catholicism today is fundamentally a product of these simultaneous, parallel processes of political and religious decolonization. Catholic decolonization preceded the political decolonization of European empires. As World War I's ravages came mercifully to a close, Vatican elites perceived a crisis. Missionary recruitment was slowing, a casualty of secularization and the war. But churches outside of Europe were unprepared for a post-missionary future, as the ties between European Catholics and colonial officials and the hierarchies and tensions within Catholic communities across European empires had done real damage to the church's appeal in Asia and Africa. In response to this situation, Popes Benedict VI and Pius XI issued two papal proclamations that many historians now argue was the beginning of Catholic decolonization. Maximum Illud, 1919, and Rerum Ecclesiae, 1926, marked a decisive change in the relationship between Rome, missions, and colonial empires. These proclamations criticized missionaries who, and I'm quoting here, displayed more zeal for the profit of some particular nation than for the kingdom of God, and accused some missionaries of twisting their missions into forms of spiritual and cultural colonialism. They made it clear that the only way to ensure the church's future outside of Europe was to expand the ranks and roles of local clergy in ways that missionaries had been largely unwilling to do. I'm quoting again, "Only the local priest," read Maximum Illud, "one with his people by birth, by nature, by his sympathies and his aspirations, is effective in appealing to their mentality and thus attracting them to the faith." These proclamations also imagined the eventuality of the end of empire. "Let us suppose," read Rerum Ecclesiae, "that inhabitants of a particular territory, desiring to become free and independent, should drive away the foreign nation to whom they are subject. Everybody can see what a great harm would accrue to the church in that land unless a native clergy has been spread beforehand." These documents, in a way that was quite radical for the time, also directly questioned the racial hierarchies that were normative to both empires and missions in the 19th century. Quoting again, "Anyone who looks upon these natives as members of an inferior race or as men of low mentality," read Rerum Ecclesiae, "makes a grievous mistake. If one sees a lack of ability among them, this is largely due to conditions under which they exist." During the interwar era, reform-minded elites in Rome began a systematic institutional decolonization of mission-led churches. They coordinated the expansion into missions of Catholic societies and orders devoted to developing self-sustaining churches. They assumed full control over the finances of many lay Catholic organizations funding mission work. They sent apostolic delegates around Asia and Africa to establish more direct ties to Catholic elites, more of whom began going to Rome to study. They led reforms to seminaries and funded new Catholic periodicals in local languages. They directed the worldwide spread of lay associational networks under the banner of Catholic Action, developed in 19th century Europe to organize parts of society, notably workers, youth, and women, who had little formal representation in the church. These associations would be particularly critical in the 1930s as vehicles for Catholic mutual aid and mobilization, in a time when colonial administrations proved incapable or unwilling to face that decade's profound economic crisis. Mass devotional gatherings like Papal Days and national Eucharistic congresses began to be held in Africa and Asia. Perhaps the most significant change, the one that first had caught my attention as a young scholar, were the ordinations of Asian and African bishops, the most decisive step toward independent church hierarchies in these regions. India in 1923, China in 1926, Vietnam in 1933, Uganda in 1939, Lesotho in 1942, and so forth. Singapore in 1977, I believe. The Vatican's decisive shift toward building national churches often elicited defensive reactions from missionary authorities. But it did receive broad support from a smaller cohort of Europeans now leaving for missions, who had been humbled by the carnage of the war and the now inescapable contradictions between colonial rhetoric and reality. The decolonization of missions was for Rome also, of course, an effort to centralize and regularize the structures of governance and authority linking the ultramontane church to all of the world's Catholics. For Rome, decolonization and integration were mutually constitutive processes. One historian has argued that ultramontanism, in his words, paralleled the great empires and national states of the 19th century, which used new means of communication and transportation to consolidate power, enforce unity, and build bureaucracies. If you'll permit my own perhaps irreverent extension of this idea, to me the imperial project it mirrors most closely is the Soviet Union's, which began at precisely the same moment, and whose sustained systematic project to cultivate national units through institutional, territorial, and cultural means, to me, in odd ways, mirrors the Vatican's version of a centralizing decolonization in interesting ways. The significant divergences between these two cases, I hope, are obvious enough to not require further attention or comment. Of course, like political decolonization, Catholic decolonization was emphatically not solely or principally a European project. From the beginning, Vatican reforms were a recognition of the frustration and even anger of many Catholics around the world with mission life, and a response to their desire for a different future for their churches. Expressions of this feeling were everywhere in the early 20th century. Letters to Rome, rapturous welcomes for Vatican envoys and apostolic delegations, articles in the Catholic press, enthusiastic participation in lay associations and mass gatherings, and perhaps especially in affirmations of autonomy and occasional acts of defiance towards missionary superiors. This was a moment of fluorescence for what the historian Rennie Chow Choi describes as an effort to confront and transcend, in her words, the under-acknowledged imperial legacy of ancestral feeling for the Western Christian heritage. For colonized people, this sense of feeling generated both a powerful attachment to and a simultaneous sense of exclusion from the church's genealogical pedigrees, in a way that relegated them to a condition of, in her words, perpetual belatedness in the global Catholic world. As a spiritual and cultural process, she argues, Catholic decolonization was not an attempt to reroot faith identities exclusively in local histories. It was, in fact, an effort to transcend history entirely, to cultivate a new ancestral feeling that transcended long-standing tensions between religious identities and ethnic identities. As rich as the new scholarship about the 20th century church is, scholars have only begun to study this dynamic, the cultural dimensions of Catholic decolonization, which is really, of course, what gave real meaning to the Vatican's institutional decolonization. I can only gesture here to the complexity and richness of this process around the world by foregrounding a few recent scholarly works that explore aspects of the subject. Catholic decolonization, to begin with, meaningfully globalized theologies of enculturation. As Jin Liu shows in her new book, a wonderful book, during the 50 years before Vatican II, Chinese theologians writing in French and English and moving between China, France, Belgium, and Rome explored a theology of enculturation that was grounded not in missionary theology's static conceptions of China, but in a more multifaceted and meaningfully historical understanding of its culture, one deeply in tune with its mystical traditions. Liu shows how by transcending the lastic epistemic hegemony of missionary thought, these Chinese theologians brought the spiritual aspirations of Chinese Catholics into the so-called new theology that would prove so central to Vatican II. Their African equivalent, perhaps, were the self-professed black priests, whose 1956 work, Des prêtres noirs s'interrogent, which roughly means some black priests are asking questions, affirmed African metaphysical systems as legitimate theological interlocutors. Catholic decolonization also drove fertile engagement between Catholic intellectuals and the vibrant intellectual experiments of late colonial societies. Scholars of the Senegalese intellectual and statesman Léopold Sédar Senghor have regularly de-emphasized Catholicism influence on his vision of negritude, a movement to valorize African experiences, cultural forms, ethics, and aesthetics in the search for a post-colonial humanism. But David Ngang offers a reading of Senghor's negritude as fundamentally grounded in an African theology. Ngang reads Senghor's negritude as an explicitly Christian vision of rebirth, offered as a response to a heretical colonial vision of creation. The hierarchy and violence of colonialism, in Senghor's eyes, represented a refusal of communion. It was a ritual through which Africans were spiritually consumed and sacrificed rather than reborn. African suffering, he contends, was for Senghor a form of martyrdom. It was, in his words, not only a site where reconciliation and healing may be achieved, but a context where the world may be transformed and remade from a brutal and brutalizing place to one of friendship and communion. In these vibrant spiritual and intellectual milieus of Catholic decolonization, new forms of politics inevitably emerged. One of the most illustrative cases of this is late colonial Vietnam, which I explored in my first book and has since received fuller treatment by my colleague Phi Van Nguyen. Catholic politics in late colonial Vietnam reflected many influences. Social Catholicism's 19th century critique of industrial capitalism's inequality and exploitation, the Vatican's increasingly strident anti-communism, and new forms of European Catholic social doctrine. Perhaps the most significant was personalism, a philosophy and theology reacting to modernity's depersonalizing march by reaffirming the value and dignity of the human person as an irreducible subject and the fundamental basis of community. In late colonial Vietnam, as in many other colonial contexts, these interrelated but ultimately distinct strands of global Catholic political thought shaped a range of new Catholic political forms. Many of them were explicitly anti-colonial, although they were rarely revolutionary or oriented toward violence. They found voice and structure in the changing social fabric of a decolonizing church, its new periodicals, associations, and mass gatherings. But even in the late colonial era, it was clear that new forms of Catholic politics, despite their grounding in a shared faith, were situated across the spectrum of late colonial politics, and that they had unclear and at times uneasy relationships to one another. As would become clear during political decolonization, faith was inseparable from new forms of global Catholic politics, but its influence was in no way deterministic. When the Second Vatican Council opened in 1962, many hoped, as some would for decades after, that the epochal event might be the harbinger of the end of Catholic history, in the sense that Francis Fukuyama would later propose at the end of the Cold War, a supposition that humanity had reached an endpoint of its sociological evolution and its ideal and final form of government. Vatican II was certainly a culmination of the two core dynamics of Catholic decolonization during the first half of the century. Institutionally, it brought nearly to an end the Eurocentric missionary colonial model for the Church, and refashioned its hierarchy around the principle that it must be, to quote one of the Council's contributors, not the source of the actual life of the Church, but the coordinator of that life's various and peripheral spontaneities. Theologically and culturally, the Council affirmed vernacular worship, a far greater autonomy for local forms of liturgical expression and reflection, direct engagement with the dizzying changes of modern life, and greater dialogue with and respect for other faiths. As the Council beckoned to the possibility of a church freed from much of its history, idealistic interpreters of the process of political decolonization simultaneously unfolding expressed similar hopes for the world writ large. Of course, the religious and political decolonization of mid-century was not an end of history for the Catholic Church, but the beginning of a new era in its history, an era whose evolutions few observers at the time could have predicted. The landscape of the decolonizing world quickly proved to be as or even more fraught for new national churches to navigate as the imperial world quickly fading away. In communist and other contexts of left-wing political hegemony, China, North Vietnam, Algeria, the church faced severe repression. In the case of Algeria, the mass exodus of most native Catholics with the European settler population effectively ended the church's presence there. Even outside of radical contexts like these, many post-colonial states pursued robustly secular nation-building programs that sought, in one scholar's words, to accommodate religious diversity by locating the state beyond individual religious communities in a mode of strategic difference. Across the decolonizing world, the church's minority status and complex relationship to departing colonial regimes were formidable obstacles to overcome. But in most cases, dire forecasts for the church's future in those places did not materialize. Like the colonial regimes they replaced, many post-colonial states were institutionally weak and found it useful to cooperate with Catholic educational, public health, and social welfare networks, which had generally survived European departures. That this was possible in contexts of political decolonization testifies to the success of the past half-century's enculturation efforts, which did much to insulate Asian and African Catholicism from claims of foreignness and cultural inauthenticity in new, often volatile political and social conditions. New national churches, of course, could not and did not escape the Cold War's profound political divisions. In parts of the global South, some churches, with the Vatican's strident anti-communism as a guiding light, made full-fledged cooperation with authoritarian regimes one strategy against cultural and institutional precarity. In many of these very same places, priests and laity drew from Vatican II's renewed focus on human rights and dignity and became critics of authoritarian abuses of labor, minority groups, democratic norms, and the environment, as well as critics of the complicity or silence of their church hierarchies in these abuses. Still others sought to position their churches as nonpartisan mediators or moral arbiters, sometimes successfully, more often quixotically. In a broad sense, one could argue that political decolonization drove transformations in Catholic politics across the global South that were very similar to those that had taken place in Europe about a century before, during its own transition to modern politics. In both contexts, older autocratic political forms, royalist or imperial, gave way to modernizing, more firmly secular states and new forms of mass politics that led to newly diverse forms of Catholic political expression. Global Catholicism's theological and spiritual landscape has taken equally unprecedented or unexpected turns since the Second Vatican Council. At the time of the Council, the transition to national churchhood in the decolonizing world was a driving force for its vision of enculturation, ecumenism, and modernism. But 50 years later, it is precisely in the global South where one sees the most meaningful challenges to the Council's now strained global blueprint for the Church's future. Asian Catholicism has been a site for the intensification of a triple dialogue with non-Christian peoples, religions, and cultures. Some have taken enculturation and expansion of lay autonomy far enough to prompt reprimands from Rome for being too liberal. In Africa, in contrast, enculturation has given rise to more charismatic, supernatural, and prophetic expressions of the faith, with roots not only in local cultures, but also, which is often forgotten, in the deeper history of European Catholicism. In the mid-20th century, enculturated forms of African Catholicism often aligned with movements for political liberation and human rights. But today, many reflect more conservative stances on issues such as abortion, AIDS, women's and gay rights, and interfaith relations. It is, of course, limiting and even hopeless to generalize regionally like this. One finds myriad versions and visions of Catholicism in all regions of the world. But the bigger point remains. 50 years after Vatican II, many Catholics around the world, for many reasons and in many ways, do not fully share the Council's vision of how their faith relates to the culture and politics of their world. The contemporary church thus offers us a broader lesson about the past that is unfortunately all too clear in many other realms of today's turbulent world. Simply put, that history may not be the most useful guide for predicting the future. Perhaps it would be fitting here to give the final word to Scripture, in this case, Ecclesiastes 7:14. In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and your comments.
Thank you very much, Professor Keith. We will now commence the question and answer session. May I invite Professor Noor Amali Ibrahim to the floor to moderate the session.
Well, thank you, Charles, for such a wonderful talk about this complex entanglement between Catholicism, colonization, and decolonization. So we have some time for Q&A. There are 2 mics up there, so if you have questions, please step up to the mic. Please introduce yourself and also keep your question brief. So I now invite you to ask questions. While we wait for the audience to think about the talk, maybe I will exercise my moderator privilege and ask the first question. I wonder, Charles, if you could say a little bit more about the Asian and African priests in the context of decolonization. And I'm really curious about how Catholicism informed their arguments for decolonization, right? So did Catholicism provide the vocabulary or the theology for their projects of independence? Were there new interpretations of scripture? Yeah, what's going on there?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, so, I mean, one thing I could point to, drawing from the case that I know best, of course, which is Vietnam. I mentioned social Catholicism in the talk. I could say a little bit more about that. What you saw during the Depression was kind of through the spread of these lay associations, often headed by priests, were ideas about the sort of theologies and ways of thinking about industrial capitalism, right, and its inequalities. So sort of modern kind of social critiques of Catholic social critiques of industrial capitalism that were very vibrant in late 19th century Europe, and that kind of emerged and spread in colonial contexts in the 1930s, right? So during the Depression, so a moment of economic crisis, but also as a result a moment of political crisis for European empires. So yeah, the kind of circulation of those ideas was really, really important. And I mean, I see here also, I'm not the first to observe it, but this is sort of the origin of what would become liberation theology, of course, in the Latin American context as well, right? I didn't really talk much about Latin America. The way that it figures into this global story is a little bit more complex because obviously the sort of chronology of colonization and decolonization is a little bit different, but yeah, people often think of and speak of Latin America as decolonizing at this time in the same way. So across the world you do see these sorts of new theologies grounded in ideas about human rights and dignity in the context of modern economic realities that are particularly critical. Right? So one answer to the question for sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
So I'm not a historian, and I'm afraid I have not read your book.
That's quite all right.
Just for the context. I was noting what you said about how in the post-colonial period, often Catholics were in line with anti-communist authorities. That makes a lot of sense to me. And in light of that, I've been sort of puzzled as what I perceive as an explosion of the Catholic Church in Vietnam in particular, which seems in contrast to China. And I was just curious to know if you could explain that to me. Is it merely a result of French colonialism, or is it something more?
So, yeah, I don't think it really has much to do with French I mean, it's hard to say. I don't draw really a direct line there. I mean, I would put growths in the church in Vietnam in the last couple generations, more in the context of a sort of broader religious revival. There's also, I mean, I think evangelical Christianity is spreading even more quickly than Catholicism, so it's probably connected to that, to changing globalization, changing market relations. I mean, in contrast to China, there was never sort of an official church in Vietnam like in China, right? And I think relationships between the Vatican and the Vietnamese government have generally been better than relations between the Vatican and the Chinese government, which I think helps a lot as well. Yeah. But no, like I mentioned, and this was one surprise when I wrote my book. When I really dug into what I could find in terms of demography and population statistics, I expected to see a kind of a spike in conversions connected to, of course, the larger missionary presence, and I really didn't see that. And other cases that have at least adequate data to make the claim kind of, more or less bear that out as well, right? So yeah, I mean, at the moment, the high moment of the missionary presence in Vietnam, if anything, conversions sort of slowed, right? So. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I find it really fascinating to hear about Christianity and Catholicism from the perspective of a historian. Could I just ask, after you've done so much research on Christianity and empire, do you think there's somehow some intrinsic connection between Christianity and the political form of empire, even if only in a negative, as a sort of negative image of empire? Because I've heard many people make the argument that Christianity is somehow deeply rooted in a kind of imperial imaginary. So even if not in terms of political and legal structures, is Christianity itself, in its search for a kind of universalism, deeply tied to the imaginary of an empire in some ways?
That's an excellent question. It's a very loaded word, right? And it's certainly, it's a word that's been associated with Christianity for a very long time, right? And in a spiritual sense, right? A sort of juridical sense as well, as I mentioned. So, I mean, my way of thinking about this is less to say kind of yes or no, but more in sort of how I think about the concept of empire and the parallels that between that way of thinking about what empire is and how it works, and the church's modern history, right, as I tried to sort of talk about in the talk. So as clearly a sort of centralized or centralizing institution, one that has various levels of authority, that's global, that has been a source for kind of cross-cultural contact, exchange, migration. I guess the point is the way that there's often a sort of pejorative quality to answering the question one way or the other, right? As there has been in the past, right? So calling the church an empire in the past has had this kind of pejorative element to it. And denying its imperial qualities is a sort of defensive, right? And that's sort of what I think a lot of this scholarship tries to move beyond, right? I mean, it's situated, the possibility of thinking about the church as an empire in this way is situated alongside, I would say, a pretty capacious understanding of the concept of empire. We now speak, for example, of, empires of commodities, right? So there's a good recent book called Empire of Cotton. I don't know if anybody's read it, right? So and if anything, I think the word empire the category is used perhaps a bit too liberally, right? It can start to lose meaning. But I think, in the context of the church, thinking seriously about it, about that concept and how it applies to the church, I think is useful. It's illuminating in kind of understanding some dynamics in its modern history. So, yeah, that's sort of how I see the relationship of the concept to the history that I'm talking about.
Hi, Joshua Tan from the History Department. Thanks very much for the talk. I guess to kind of follow on the previous question, I mean, could we also say something about the church's anti-empire, right? Especially in terms of the early 20th century context.
Yes.
I mean, something you mentioned I thought was very interesting was this impetus of centralizing decolonization.
Right.
Right, that you link with the Soviet Union's, somewhat top-down approach towards
Yeah.
the Eastern Europe. I guess the question then, if we think about that anti-imperial or anti-colonial
Yes.
sentiment, I mean, even in the early 20th century, I mean, maybe we're
Right.
more familiar with Vatican II, but
Right.
to what extent was that really anti-imperial? I mean, I guess maybe to expand a little bit on that. I mean, was it?
Yes.
What were the circumstances that were leading to it? And even if the actors from above, right, maybe they were trying to shore up power by establishing these structures. Did it open up the conditions of possibility for something else from
Right.
Asian or African bishops
Right.
in the aftermath? Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah,
very much.
no, that's an excellent question. And I'm glad you mentioned the Soviet Union as an anti-imperial empire. Yeah, it's arguably even a blasphemous comparison. I was kind of trying to have a little fun with it, but no, it occurred to me. I mean, the parallels are. I mean, what made me think of it was the very explicit kind of nation-building qualities of the Soviet Union, right? The nationalities policy and the sort of formal delineation of national territories and active projects to cultivate national identities through. Educational programs and publications, and really striking. I mean, of course, all nations are on some level the product of empires, but in the Soviet case, it was this very kind of intentional nation-building program, right? And the Soviet Union was, of course, also an anti-imperial empire, right? The parallel stopped there, right? It was, again, more to be a little bit provocative and creative than anything else. But to the second part of your question. Yeah, one thing that also really surprised me when I was first writing this book and I first started to dig into the kinds of, this is small, it's really not a huge number of people, but it's kind of a small group of elite reformers at the Vatican in the early interwar era. And the kind of language they were using, which was often even more forcefully anti-imperialistic than the papal proclamations, which I mentioned in the talk, which are really worth reading in full, by the way. I mean, they're really fascinating documents. Yeah, what was surprising to me, I guess, was how little of a need they felt to be kind of diplomatic vis-a-vis, imperial administrations. Often, so, things like the apostolic delegates, for example. I mean, in the case of Vietnam, the first apostolic delegate was in 28, I think. And this was something that the French administration really resisted and was very unhappy about. And, through the high levels of the foreign ministry, tried to oppose. And, it happened anyway, right? So, I really do think that... yeah, and again, you see it in what they were saying, what they were writing. They were articulating a very forceful moral critique of imperialism. This was far more than just a tactical preparation for the possible eventuality of political decolonization. This was a really moral critique of empire that I really respected when I read it, right? So, yeah, I don't think it's inaccurate to describe these driving figures at the Vatican as anti-imperialists of a kind, right? When it starts to get a little more complicated is when anti-colonial movements, across the empires start to get quite radical, right? I mean, so there you start to see, and then, of course, kind of anti-communism. That's where the Vatican's anti-communism kind of intersects with what's happening, political developments across the empire. So, of course, anti-imperialism as a general orientation is fine, but if it means radical left political movements, then that's another story, right? So, Thanks for the question.
I'm Emily. I'm an undergrad, so I'm sorry if the question is a little bit simple, but
No, please.
You mentioned just now about when the missionaries were in certain areas, they tried to not discredit other religions, especially in the Islamic context. But I think for me, I'm more interested in about in the Indian context. So I was wondering, what approaches did they take to be not discriminatory against other religions when they were trying to preach? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, when I was writing this book, I kind of got to know individual missionaries, so to speak. Those who, fortunately left, enough letters for their own careers and personalities and worldviews to come out. And, one thing you see is just, this is, and I tried to gesture to this in the talk, right? I mean, this is getting back to your question, right? On a broad structural level, thinking about, the church as a form of empire, I think makes sense in all these ways, right? But on the level of individual missionaries, you had enormous, range of behavior, right? I mean, in the case of Vietnam, again, the case I know best, you had missionaries who were there for 50, 60 years who spoke the languages perfectly and who had just a profound connection to the place and the people. And then you had missionaries who came with, very sort of pejorative ideas and attitudes and who were not really capable or prepared to do mission work. Some who had a very difficult time with the demands of, what that entailed. And, so some who acted very, in very damaging ways, vis-a-vis, local practices, right? So this is something that's really hard to generalize about. I mean, I think in predominantly Muslim places, right, there is a sort of a long-standing, obviously the sort of presence of Islam in Catholic thought generated a very different kind of set of relationships and attitudes than it did in non-Islamic contexts, right? So, yeah, I mean, I know it's a bit of a cop-out to say, well, it depends, but it really does depend, right? I think, the fortunes of a particular Catholic mission, I think, really depended a whole lot on, on a lot of things, but in no small part on the kinds of attitudes that, missionaries had, and, their way of dealing with people outside of the religion. Right?
Yeah. Thank you so much for a really wonderful talk, Charles. I have two follow-up questions about the Catholic missionaries. The first, I think when we think about the Catholic missionaries, we also actually see them as a kind of very diverse group in the sense that they include many different orders, including like MEP, Franciscans, Jesuits, and many others. So do you see any differences in terms of their missionary efforts or so-called civilization projects in the empires? Second question is more about the kind of work they do. As you mentioned in your lecture, that many of them were kind of ethnographers and also even like gathering intelligence as well. And they are also what scholars consider as a kind of Orientalists as well in terms of knowledge production in their empires, right? So I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about the kind of knowledge production that they were doing. Were they studying other traditions, learning local languages? And also, I know that like for some British Orientalists, there were actually philologists as well, studying other religious traditions. So were the Catholic missionaries doing the same in the for instance, French Empire, but also in other parts of the world? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So as to your second question, yeah, I mean, I think, missionaries were, I think often could be, the best informed and most insightful. The best of them, right? Had a knowledge of, especially local languages. So some of the works that they think, for Vietnamese, a lot of the important dictionaries, of course, were missionary authored. So, yeah, one of the people I was thinking of when I answered a previous question was a man named Léopold Gadière, who, if you study Vietnam, is quite familiar. A really brilliant observer and interpreter of popular religion, one who, came to appreciate it so much that he, being a missionary in some ways sort of stopped being his principal focus, right? And he lived in Vietnam for almost 60 years, right? There's a huge corpus of missionary authored scholarship. A lot of it is, what we describe as, anthropological or ethnographic. Historical as well, and then, philology and dictionaries as well. So, and invaluable. And I think, once sort of, written off, I think, writing it off as colonial knowledge is, I think it's often can be a little bit too hasty, and I think people have maybe come to rediscover the value of some of this material, right? And the first part of your question, Jack, if you would. Right, yes. So, here too, just a huge range. I didn't really talk about them as much in the talk, but of course there were orders that didn't focus on mission work, right? They focused on education or health, and you started to see, I mentioned this briefly in the talk, but more support from Rome for those kinds of orders coming in the interwar era, right? To prioritize, in a sense, institutional development, right? And in the context of, seminaries or health establishments, right? And the idea of, developing these more fully, but also kind of staffing them, transitioning them from European authority to local authority. And this starts to happen in, before the Second World War in many Catholic contexts, right? An enormous range. I would say, rather than trying to characterize each of the many mission societies, I would say that there was a distinct difference made between, if a French missionary society was acting in the context of a French colony, right, like the Missions étrangères de Paris, right? So there is a real kind of, I would say, confluence between, eventually between their activities and a kind of a growing sense of nationalism, right, in a sense of actually sort of support for the national colonial project, right? They start to feel that they have a stake in it, right, when they're operating, when they're acting as missionaries in their own empire, so to speak, right? So you see a real difference in the French Empire between French missionary societies and missionary societies with predominantly people from other places, right? In part because they're not as invested in the national colonial project, and often they're viewed as I mentioned, with kind of hostility and suspicion, right? So, so Spanish missionaries, there were quite a number of Spanish, the biggest diocese actually in Vietnam in the colonial period was Spanish run. So this caused all sorts of problems with colonial authorities who were, quite hostile, even more hostile to the Spanish missionaries because they were Spanish, right? So the Spanish missionaries in Vietnam had absolutely, no love lost for French colonization. They really sort of would have been happy to see it disappear even more quickly than it did.
Thank you for the wonderful talk.
Thanks,
I have a vested interest in thinking about the church as empire, but we also realize that the term empire has evolved over time, just like how you say the Catholic Church has evolved from the pre-modern to modern times. So maybe the first question I would like to ask you is, do you think we can see the Catholic Church in the pre-modern era as kind of an antique classical form of empire, comparing, for example, to the Roman, the Chinese empires, jostling with modern political empires? So two different forms of empires coexisting at the same time. And the second question pertains to the maintenance of this empire, where we know empires are not just maintained from the center, but from the peripheries as well. So the brokers of empires, perhaps even in today's age, would be the bishops' conferences that are happening, and there's autonomy and agency there within the bishop conference itself.
Right.
So could we see this management of diversity coming from the periphery to the center?
Right. Yeah, excellent question. So as far as the early modern period goes, so I made the case in the talk that there was a particular moment in the first half of the 20th century, late 19th, that this was the moment that, when the church most closely resembled or, could be described as a global empire. if that's the case, it's the global part of that claim that really makes the case for that, right? I mean, I think if you look at the early modern cases, for example, obviously the role of the Catholic Church in European empire in the Americas, it's just so profoundly entrenched and inseparable. That's the case where, I think Church's empire most directly applies, right? And in some ways in the sort of most negative way, right? Thinking about other early modern contexts, I actually don't think so. The sort of, a lot of the kind of older historiography, I think, is a little bit too quick to think of missionary activity in early modern Asia as this kind of proto-imperial presence. I don't know, I tend to find the category less useful for thinking about the history of missions in Asia before the 19th century. One of the reasons why, I think drawing from some of this scholarship, I really think kind of in terms of sort of typologies of how we either use the category empire or not, what we really need to be quite, intentional temporally, right? So we can't speak about the relationship between church and empire, the church as an empire, and the sort of broad sweep from the 16th century to the present. That really makes no sense, right? If it was a form of an empire, it's certainly one that evolved and was manifested very, very differently in different contexts, right? If that makes sense.
That's all the time we have for Q&A. If you have questions, please stay for refreshments and have a chat with our speaker. For now, please help me and thank Professor Charles Keith for generously sharing his work with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention and your questions and for being here tonight. Thank you.